Hey guys, so in this video, I'm going to be doing my 2024 election prediction. Okay. Uh, of course, the second I start this video, someone decides to text me. Anyways, so today we're going to be doing our 2024 election prediction, hypothetically, this is hypothetical, between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So it's essentially a rematch to the same tickets, except we replaced Mike Pence with Ron DeSantis because Ron DeSantis is more of a paleo conservative than Mike Pence is. Plus the fact that really, Mike Pence, these past few days, it's a reportedly he unfollowed Trump on Twitter. He apparently doesn't have a very good relationship with Donald Trump. So, I doubt that he'd pick Pence again. So let's just start by filling out our safe states for Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. There'd be a number of these. They'd probably expand on their safe states in 2020. Colorado actually did end up being safe. I had it as likely. But I think New Mexico would be safe. The state's trending to the left overall. I think Trump would still do better than your average Republican with Hispanics, but not necessarily as well as he did in 2020. So yeah, Biden would also carry Hawaii. By a safe margin, he'd win Illinois. Virginia, he won by upwards of 10%, so he'd only need to do 2% better in my book to make that a safe margin. I think he'd do that. Suburbs are really trending away from Democrats, and Trump's just gotten a lot more extreme, even since November of 2020, so I think he'd probably lose Virginia by 15%. All these northeastern states that are always safe Democrat. New York would be safe Democrat. Maine also would be safe. I think Biden went it by like 8 or 9. I think he'd, like I said, Maine is trending to the right overall, like a little bit, but not really too much. It's essentially going to be a blue state. But I still wouldn't bet on it narrowing up too much because I think Trump's gotten a lot more unpopular because of the DC riots and just 2024 Joe Biden being the incumbent. That would be advantageous to everyone getting vaccinated for COVID-19. Hopefully, I don't want to jinx it, but it looks like that's going to end up happening. So yeah. Now taking a look at the safe Trump states, I think that Montana would barely be safe. He'd win it by like 13 or 14. All of Nebraska, except the second district, would be safe. Kansas would not be safe. I actually made the mistake of putting Kansas as safe this year. It ended up being likely. Oklahoma would be safe. I think Missouri would be safe. I think it was like a 15 or 16 point Trump state this year. He'd probably win it by the same margins. He's trending to the right overall, so I don't see Trump doing too much worse than he did in 2020, even though he'd probably do worse than in 2024 than he did in 2020. Arkansas would be safe. Louisiana would be safe. Alabama would be safe. Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, and West Virginia would all be safe. So that's 94 safe electoral votes for Donald Trump compared to over 200 for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Now, I'm actually going to make a bit of a gamble here. I actually, for those of you who don't know, some of these videos I script, some of these I don't script. But I didn't map this out before, so I could, not, because sometimes I sneak up on myself and I'm like, wait a minute. But I'm going to say that Joe Biden would win Arizona by a likely margin. And I think he'd win Arizona by a likely margin because of a couple things. First of all, like I said, Trump's gotten a lot more unpopular with essentially everyone with the DC riots. I see a lot of people, this is just Twitter, but I see a lot of people who say they regret voting for Trump. A lot of people I know in real life say they regret voting for Trump after what happened in DC on January 6th. And he got banned by Twitter, which is basically how he gets a lot of his news coverage from his tweets. So, yeah, but Arizona, I think Trump would lose by 5 to 6%. It trends to the left overall. I mean, we've only, in 2014, the Republicans won the and even in that doesn't count, but in 2014, they won the governorship by a safe margin. They also just did very well in the House. Like, they won the House vote in 2014 by 10%. Mitt Romney in 2012 won the state by 10%. So the state is a state that has been historically Republican, and it flipped. The Senate seat there flipped in 2018, and the Democrats flipped another seat there in 2020. They also flipped the state as a whole for the first time, like they won it for the first time since 1996. So Arizona's trending to the left, and just the growing suburbs of Maricopa County, suburbs of Phoenix, are getting bluer and bluer. And I think Joe Biden would be able to run up the score in Phoenix and do well enough in the suburbs to outweigh Trump's rural support. And I think Biden would also, for the record, I do think Biden would flip Navajo County. So yeah, Arizona, I think he'd win it by 5 or 6%. So yeah, Arizona. I'm actually not going to touch Nevada just yet. Minnesota, I think, would be a similar margin for Biden, maybe a little bigger, maybe a little smaller, but he'd probably win it by around 7. I actually underestimated Biden in the state. I was kind of assuming that the Rust Belt would be less elastic and vote more in line with each other. We ended up seeing, it was actually quite interesting. Trump won Ohio by like 8%, but he lost Minnesota by 7%, which is incredible because in 2016 he won Ohio by around 8%, and he lost Minnesota by only 2%. So Ohio didn't really swing to the left, whereas Minnesota swung to the left big time. So I think we'd see a similar thing happen in Minnesota. I think we'd see, the suburbs really went against Trump this year, and I think he'd do even worse there in 2024. I also think that Trump wouldn't be able to, like there's a lot of hype this year about Trump maybe flipping Minnesota and flipping Lake County. People say that if a Republican wants to win Minnesota, they have to win Lake County. That's essentially the bar. I don't think Trump would win Lake County, so I wouldn't bet on Minnesota flipping anytime soon. Now going over to our next likely state, New Hampshire would be likely. This is probably be like an 8 or 9 point win for Democrats. The Democratic Party of New Hampshire has quietly been doing very well here. I mean, they've done well organizing. They've found good Senate candidates to run. And, there are 2 House seats that are actually more historically Republican. This is actually a Republican gerrymander. They actually hold both those House seats and won them fairly comfortably this year. So, the New Hampshire Democratic Party, I just want to take a moment to express that they're one of the better Democratic parties. They're not as bad as the Democratic Party of Florida, for example, or the Democratic Party. I don't know. I'm trying to think of another Democratic Party that's horrible at winning elections. Ohio Democratic Party is pretty bad, but you get what I'm trying to say here. So New Hampshire, I think Biden would carry the state. We're talking about maybe a 8-9 point margin. Like I said, he'd probably do a little better this year because he'd do better in the suburbs. He'd probably do the same in urban areas, although New Hampshire is not really an urban state. And I think he'd do about the same in the suburbs. So the suburbs will stay the same. And overall, just talking about the country as a whole in 2024, if this is a matchup, I think Trump would do worse in the suburbs, a lot worse in the suburbs, but he'd do the same in urban areas and maybe the same in rural areas, but maybe a tiny bit better, but really nothing changes. Suburbs are what swing to the left. I also forgot to mention Nebraska's second district would be likely Biden. He went up by like 6 or 7 this year, I think. And I think he'd win it by even bigger margin in 2024. So now let's move on to our likely Trump states. We've got a lot of these, starting with Alaska. I think Trump he went up by like 10 or 11, I think, this year. So it wouldn't really trend to the right overall. So I think he'd be able to carry it by a similar margin, maybe a little less. Utah, I think this is a dark horse for being only likely Republican. Back in like June, people were saying this is going to be likely Trump, but then by the time November came around, we realized that poll was just an outlier, and that it had nothing to do with Utah as a whole, and that Biden was going to lose Utah by like 20 to 25%. But I really do think that with Salt Lake City, the bluest part of the state is growing fast at a faster rate than the Republican parts of the state. So yeah, I'm gonna say basically that Trump's gonna win Utah, but by only like 10 or 11% as opposed to the 20% margin he carried it by this year, and also because he's getting more and more unpopular with the Republican establishment. Like, there are some Republicans calling for him to be removed from office or resign, like Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, actually Adam Kinzinger from Illinois, I believe that's his name. So yeah, and these are people in Congress. Like, these aren't just your your Bill Kristols and your Bill Welds of the world. These are actual people in Congress from Republican states too, like Alaska. Lisa Murkowski could easily get primaried for that, but yeah. Now moving on to our next likely Republican state, I think Kansas would be likely. I do think Trump would do a lot worse than suburbs. Kansas, fun fact that I don't think a lot of people know. Joe Biden actually won the suburban Kansas vote. He won it by like 1 or 2% this year, so he actually won both the urban and suburban vote in Kansas, and the Democrat hasn't done that since like the 60s or something like that. So that was a bit of an interesting factoid right there. But either way, this is still gonna be a red state. I think Trump would win it by like 8 or 9%. But I'd count on Biden just doing better in the suburbs of Kansas City area. He also might be able to flip the county that Wichita is in. This is like a lean Republican county because the Wichita itself is Democratic, but the area surrounding it are super Republican for whatever reason. So it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, now Mississippi would also be likely. I mean, I'm just putting. Obviously, Mississippi is not really a contested state, but I think Trump would win it by under 12%. So just to put that out there, there'll be a little bit of narrowing up. South Carolina, similar thing. I think South Carolina would vote to the left of Mississippi because they're just a higher percentage of black population, and the black turnout in South Carolina is slightly higher. So I think Biden and Harris would do better in South Carolina than Mississippi, but they'd still be able to they'd still be able to carry it by a pretty decent margin. Now, Iowa and Ohio, I think, would be likely. These are less solid than, say, your Mississippis of the world, but I think that these are both pretty Republican states at this point. I mean, Biden actually targeted Ohio. He actually visited it like on November 2nd, the day before the election, before I went to Pennsylvania to wrap it all up. But Ohio was not really a good bet for him. He probably could have flipped North Carolina if he actually spent time in there. He didn't really spend time in North Carolina as much as he did in Ohio, so I guess that was one of the bad parts of his campaign. But, overall, Biden ran a decent campaign this year. But anyways, going back to the state of Ohio, this state has not. I thought the state was going to narrow up significantly. Talking about Trump's 8.5-point win there in 2016, and I thought he'd win it by like half that, like 4 or 5%. I was wrong on that, and I don't see myself underestimating Trump again. No, I'm just going to put this as likely because I'm going to assume that he maintains his margin in the urban areas. Just a little worse than the suburbs. He might actually lose Delaware County, which he'd be the first Republican since, like, I don't know, Bob Dole or no. Actually, no. Bob Dole, no. Bob Dole didn't lose Delaware County. And I'm making assumptions here because I know for a fact that George Bush actually won Delaware County by 36% in 2000. So I'm not assuming that Clinton did, 36 points better than Al Gore. But whatever. But he'd be the first Republican to lose Delaware County in maybe since, I'm trying to think of like a Democratic landslide year that wasn't too recent, like maybe even LBJ, whatever. But yeah, he'd probably do worse in the suburbs. He'd actually definitely do worse in the suburbs. But he'd do about the same in the rural areas, which are growing at a faster rate than urban areas in Ohio, which are the Democratic areas of the state. And you can't just combat suburbs with rural areas, because suburbs are like lean Democratic areas at this point, whereas urban areas, the Republicans win them by like 80% in some counties. But yeah, I do think Trump would win Ohio, to make a long story short, by probably a similar margin as 2020, maybe a little less. Same thing with Iowa. I don't see Trump doing significantly worse with the white votes. That would be enough to carry him over the finish line in this very white state. So yeah, that's in the 2nd District in Maine. It will stay the same. So now moving on to our lean Biden states. Nevada, I do think would be lean. I think Biden would do better than he did this year. I think he'd do a lot better in Washoe County. He'd probably do a little better in Clark County, because I wouldn't think that Trump would make the same inroads with Hispanics. And by the way, Trump did well with Hispanics for a Republican. I'll give him credit for that. But incumbents always do better with Hispanics. Like, even like George Bush did a lot better with Hispanics in 2004 than he did in 2000. Obama did better in 2012 with Hispanics than he did in 2008. Interestingly enough, Bill Clinton did better in 1996. Reagan did better with Hispanics in 1984 than 1980. So Hispanics seem to like voting with the incumbent a little more as a percentage, but just an interesting fact. But I think the Hispanics would swing a little bit back to Biden because, like I said, Trump's gotten a lot more unpopular since the D.C. riots. And just Nevada's trending left overall. The growing Hispanic population in Clark County would not be enough. Trump could make he'd get 40% of the Hispanic vote in Clark County, and he'd still maybe end up losing Nevada. So either way, that wouldn't happen, though. So I think Nevada, he'd lose it by 3 or 4%. I think the Rust Belt, and here you go, Biden wins. The Rust Belt, I do think, would be lean for Biden. I think he'd win each of these states by 1 to 2% more than he did in 2020. And I'm just going to not go through each of these states as a whole, but I'm going to say he'd do about the same in the urban areas, a little better, actually no, not a little better, a little worse or the same in the rural areas. We're talking, if he does a little worse, it'd be like by 1%. But he's gonna do a lot better in the suburbs, in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, or Dane County, and which is where Madison is. In Michigan, that's Detroit, for example. In Pennsylvania, that's Philadelphia. So I think he'd do well enough in those places to build in the 2020 margins in all these states. He'd win each of these states, like I said, by 1 to 2% more than he did in 2020. Now, it's going to come down to the Sun Belt to see how little or how much Trump loses by. So I think Texas, he'd win by a lean margin. I don't see, especially because he does slightly better with Hispanics than your average Republican, I think he'd I do think that he would only lose Texas, or that Trump would only win Texas by 3 to 4% because he would do better with Hispanics than your average Republican. Like if you ran, trying to think of a Republican who does poorly with Hispanics, but like if you ran, I don't know, my brain isn't working today. This week has been chaotic, to say the least. And I'm filming this right after I got off school on Friday, so yeah, whatever. But Texas, I don't see Trump doing poorly enough there to lose it. Just he'd do worse in the suburbs, as I've consistently been saying. But and I do think that he'd lose Zapata County, which was. And interestingly enough, that was a flip. He won it by like 5%. That was actually like one of the few counties that Biden did worse than MJ Hager by double digits. Hager actually won the county by 10%, but Biden lost it by 5. So Zapata County is a heavily Hispanic county. So just wanted to bring that up. But yeah. So Texas, I don't see Trump doing poorly enough with Hispanics to lose the state, but it would narrow up for sure. So now let's go on to our here's a lean state. Georgia would be lean for Biden. It was tilt this year. I don't think it would be tilt again. I think, Warnock's going to win it by a lean margin. It looks like Ossoff might win it by a lean margin. It's probably going to be tilt, though. So, yeah, and I just don't see Biden doing, especially 4 years later, with these trends, Georgia being even more far gone for the Republican Party than it is right now. But I don't see these trends necessarily being enough to even narrow up, for Trump to do better than Kelly Loeffler did. He'd do better in rural areas, that's for sure, but I think he'd do a lot worse in the suburbs, actually. So that's the difference there. He'd probably lose Georgia by 2 or 3%, maybe even more. I don't know what it's going to look like 100% in 4 years. I'm just trying to, make a decent prediction 4 years out. Now, getting into our tilt states, first we're going to give Florida to Donald Trump. Because of DeSantis as running mate. And, I've gotten mixed reviews from people about DeSantis. I've actually gotten people, who live in Florida, who say, well, DeSantis is unpopular because of his COVID-19 handling. But I actually talked to one of my good friends who lives in Florida. You may know him. His name is For Political Talk. He actually said DeSantis has gone more popular as COVID-19 has progressed. He was unpopular at the start, but really, since then has gotten more popular, apparently. And I'm not going to take anyone's word for it, but I think Trump won it by 3% in 2020. I don't see Biden doing well enough with Hispanics to flip the state, so we're just going to go the safe way and say Trump wins it by 1 or 2%. Now, North Carolina, to finish this off, we don't really have any flips right now. I don't think Biden has 302 electoral votes because Texas and Florida gain a lot of electoral votes, whereas the Rust Belt loses electoral votes. Literally every state except for Wisconsin and the Rust Belt decide to lose electoral votes. So, yeah, but I think North Carolina would be our only flip. I think Biden would actually target it. He didn't really target it this year, which was bad because it hurt. Not only did it hurt him in North Carolina, it didn't cost him because he won the election, but it really hurt Cal Cunningham too. And Cal Cunningham probably was going to win the Senate race if Biden actually campaigned there with him and if he didn't have that scandal. So, yeah, but I do think North Carolina will win their lead flip. It's going to be very close, but the suburbs of North Carolina are growing a lot faster than the rural areas. The Republicans have not necessarily maxed out the rural support, but they are doing pretty well there, as they are in most of these areas with Trump. So I think Trump would actually do slightly better in the rural areas of North Carolina because he didn't max it out this year. I think he might max it out in 2024, but he'd do a lot worse in the suburbs, and I think he'd do worse in urban areas. So it'll be really close, but I do think that Trump would end up carrying state of North Carolina that Biden would carry it by like less than 1%. So that'll do it for this video. Thank you all for watching. I'm kind of in a rush here, so I may be talking a little fast. If I am, my apologies. I'm also squeaking my chair in the background, which is being louder, and I'm kind of in a weird position right now, so we guys have to move it. There we go. It didn't squeak. Okay, but yeah. So that was it. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, share with your friends. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Q&A coming out soon. I'm also going to be releasing a big video that should be out, maybe in a couple of weeks. No, that's too long. Like, let's say January 15th, around that time. So thank you all for watching this video. Like, subscribe. I've said this 3 times. I'll stop talking. Bye.